Gabrielle Chanel. She's probably the most elegant, fashionable woman of the 20th century. That is a truth that, like Jane Austen would say, is universally acknowledged. But is it actually the truth? Was Chanel truly the visionary icon that we believe her to be? Or was it nothing more than a carefully crafted illusion of her own making? Was she a genius, a fraud, or perhaps both? Let's start at the beginning and we can find out together. Gabrielle Chanel was born on August 19, 1883 in Slumber, France, into a life of poverty and instability. Her mother was a laundrywoman and her father was a street vendor, and they lived a very nomadic and uncertain life. Her father was absent for a lot of her childhood, and her mother was frequently ill, which left Gabrielle and her siblings to have to fend for themselves from a very early age. None of the children ever received any sort of formal education, and their childhood was very much marked by neglect. The chaos of her early life is evident even on her birth certificate, which mistakenly recorded her name as Gabrielle Chasnel instead of Chanel, a mistake she never actually corrected. And she actually died with that name still on record. But why would she leave it like that? Now, the answer lies in one of Chanel's defining traits. Rather than confronting the realities of her past, she preferred to rewrite them. Throughout her life, she effortlessly fabricated stories to obscure the truth of her origins, creating an image of herself that was more fantasy than fact. While it's easy to assume that her difficult childhood had a lot to do with the woman she became, and there is some truth to that, I don't think it's that simple. I think Chanel's need to reinvent herself and her almost obsessive need to completely erase her past suggests something much more complex. As she grew older, she crafted a much more glamorous version of her life, one that was almost entirely fictional. She had claimed that after her mother had passed away, her father had sailed off to America to seek his fortune, leaving her in the care of two loving aunts. Despite the fact that when her mother passed away, her father abandoned her and her sisters in an orphanage, despite him being very much alive. She even would go on to alter basic facts about her life later, like claiming that she was born a decade later than 1883 and that her mother had died when she was much younger than just 11 years old. Chanel's years at the orphanage would leave an undeniable mark on her. It was here that she would first receive a real education, and she would learn the skill that would define her career: sewing. But beyond the needle and thread, the orphanage also helped shape her aesthetic. She was surrounded in such an atmosphere of restraint and simplicity that she really developed an appreciation for clean lines, muted tones, and a minimalistic look. The contrast of light and shadow in her surroundings really was reflected as well in her black and white palette that would become the signature look of the Chanel brand. When she aged out of the orphanage, Chanel moved to a Catholic boarding house, where she worked as a seamstress by day and sang in the cabaret by night. It was in this dimly lit world of music and revelry that she would come to meet the very powerful and wealthy men that would shape her future. It was also here that she reportedly got her famous nickname, Coco. While the origins of the name remain a mystery, one of the more popular theories is that it came from Qui Vous Coco, a song that she frequently performed. Others say that it came from her infamous cocaine parties that she would host later on in life, and I think the more possible and perhaps fitting explanation was that it came from the French word cocotte, which means a kept woman or mistress. Whatever the truth may be, her time at the cabaret would truly be the beginning of her professional life and the beginning of a very long string of love affairs that she would have throughout her life that would define her rise in society. And it all started with Etienne Balsan. He was a wealthy textile heir, and he would become Chanel's first lover, who would also be the one to introduce her into the world of luxury and high fashion. By the age of 23, Chanel had become Etienne Balsan's mistress and his favorite. He indulged her in a life of luxury, showering her with gifts that she had never known before, like diamonds, gowns, and pearls. For the first time, she experienced the opulence that she had only ever dreamed of before. And once she had it, she was never going to let it go, no matter the cost or who got in the way. Chanel's relationship with men tended to be very transactional, and she walked a very thin line between being mistress and leveraging her allure solely for the purpose of wealth and social mobility. She understood the power these connections gave her, and she was unafraid to use them in a world that had once seemed entirely out of reach to her. Through Bassan, Chanel met the man that would become the most important relationship of her life, Captain Arthur Edward Boyd Capel, a wealthy English gentleman. Their affair began soon after they met, and it was with Capel that the foundation of the House of Chanel was truly laid. He installed her in a Paris apartment and financed her first jobs, giving her the means to turn her ambition into reality. I don't really believe that Chanel ever truly knew love in her lifetime, and I don't blame her. How could she? She never really saw it growing up, and she showed little interest for romance for its own sake during her life. She never really struck me as the type of woman who longed for love, but rather what she really seemed to want was power, wealth, and social status. And she knew exactly how to get all of them from the men that she slept with. However, if she ever really loved anyone in her life, it was Capel. He embodied everything she wanted to be. He was wealthy, well-connected, powerful, and effortlessly stylish. He was more than her lover and business partner. He was her muse. She admired him really deeply, so much so that she remained loyal to him during their entire affair, despite his repeated infidelities. And his influence on her was beyond their relationship. His polished, masculine look really solidified Chanel's aesthetic, with clean androgynous lines being Chanel's defining trait for her designs in the evolving landscape of the fashion world in the 1910s. Chanel's early designs include the now iconic French-style sailor blouse, the little black dress, and an array of masculine-inspired pieces in neutral tones. And while it's tempting to credit her with the invention of these styles, the truth is she didn't actually invent any of them. She merely made them popular among the elite. This, like many things in Chanel's life, became part of a carefully crafted myth. She had a talent for convincing the high society and elite people she was around that her designs were luxurious and revolutionary, when in reality they were made from inexpensive materials like jersey knit, which at the time was associated with men's underwear. And as for her so-called originality, it's more likely that she borrowed, if not outright stole, a lot of these styles and designs from lesser-known designers at the time and just never credited them. Even her successor, Karl Lagerfeld, will go on to say in an interview that she didn't actually invent any of the styles that she is known for. He said, quote, "Look, she was not the first person to cut her hair in the 20s. That was an actress called Eve Lavier, a tiny, beautiful French woman, much more beautiful than Chanel, who did it long before Chanel was around. The story for wearing real jewelry over sweaters, the first for that was Misia Cert. Chanel copied everything she did and made it commercial. This is genius, no? The quilted handbag, that even came from another company. And then they were made by Cartier with the little gold chains. But who cares? The shoes with the black toe cap, everybody had those before. And she brought them back from her youth. This is all fun, no? And it makes the story more interesting." More than a designer, Chanel was a masterful storyteller and an even better marketer. She understood the power of perception, shaping her image and brand to be something aspirational. Much of what Chanel claimed about herself seemed to come from this very deep-rooted desire to both fit in with the elite, but also stand apart from them. She wanted to be seen as different, unforgettable, and one might even say, not like other girls. Later in life, she would even insist that she always dressed ahead of her time, and she would wear unconventional clothing that women of the era would have never dared to do, but of course she did. When this was just another one of her stories, another fabrication designed to reinforce her myth of originality. In reality, she dressed much like everyone else of her generation. She was simply young at a time where fashion and society were evolving at an unprecedented rate. But rather than pioneering the movement, she simply rode its wave. Yet Chanel wanted to be remembered as revolutionary, and she understood the power of image and spectacle. So she always made a point to be seen in very popular and fashionable resort towns like Deauville and Biarritz, where the wealthy and fashion reporters would gather to report on the latest trends and styles. And Chanel was always at the center of these reports, crafting a persona for herself that made her style not only admired, but coveted. Chanel loved attention, and she knew exactly how to keep it on her. A key reason why Chanel's carefully crafted image was so effective was that she knew exactly what suited her body type, and she designed almost exclusively for women who looked like her. By today's standards, Chanel would be considered a gamine in the Kibbe body type system. Petite, lean, and androgynous with little to no curve, her slender frame, flat chest, and straight lines allowed her to wear masculine-inspired silhouettes effortlessly. But rather than designing for all women, she only catered to a specific type, herself. Her strategy was simple but brilliant. By modeling her own designs, she made them look effortlessly chic and desirable. However, the Chanel look wasn't universally flattering. It only worked on a select few. Yet she never really cared to design for other women or other body types because it wasn't the point. Her brand was tied to her own persona, and she ensured that what worked for her was aspirational to everyone else. Chanel understood better than anyone that exclusivity wasn't just about price, it was about perception. French designer Paul Poiret famously described Chanel's aesthetic as luxurious poverty, a fitting phrase considering that most of her designs were made from inexpensive materials like jersey and tricot, yet sold for exorbitant prices. This strategy proved wildly successful for her, and it made her a fortune in a remarkably short amount of time. In fact, she was able to repay Kappel's initial investment to her within just a few years, which is incredible. However, I've always found it ironic how Chanel, which is one of the biggest luxury brands in the world, synonymous with elegance and exclusivity, started out as a casual and leisure wear brand. Yet, Chanel's genius lay in how seamlessly she was able to enmesh her own personal image with her brand. The ideal Chanel woman was, in essence, her. This, I believe, is one of the earliest signs of something that is rarely talked about: her deep-rooted disdain for other women. Even though she will try and paint herself as a feminist throughout her life, her actions suggest otherwise. Time and time again, she crafted a world where she alone was the model for style, success, and desirability. And the evidence lies in some of her most famous quotes. "I don't do fashion, I am fashion." Simplicity is the keynote of all true elegance. And of course, she is the only person that can tell us what true elegance is, apparently. And of course, my personal favorite and the great pick-me one, before me, no one would have dared to dress in black, which is ridiculous, to say the least. Whether or not these grand declarations were true mattered far less than having people believe them. Regardless, by 1919, her influence was undeniable. She had opened several boutiques across France, including her now legendary location at 31 Rue Cambon in Paris, which remains a cornerstone of the brand to this day. It was at this moment that Chanel also became an official maison de couture, cementing her place in the world of fashion. At this point, Chanel seemed to have it all. Her designs were a success, she had secured her place among the elite, and she had a couple. But in December 1919, tragedy struck, when Kappel died in a car crash on his way to see her. This was a devastating blow for her, and it revealed just how much he truly meant to her. Reflecting on her loss, she later said, "His death was a terrible blow to me. In losing Kappel, I lost everything. What followed was not a life of happiness, I have to say." Her grief was so profound that she immortalized their love in the now iconic interlocking CC logo. not standing for Coco Chanel as many assume, but rather Chanel capital. With the loss of her lover and muse, Chanel started to lose momentum in her work too. And though her brand endured, her couture collection started to slowly decline in popularity, marking the beginning of a shift in her personal life and business. In 1921, Chanel began an affair with Grand Duke Dmitry Pavlovich, a member of the Russian aristocracy. Through him, she met Ernest Beau, the last Tsar's personal perfumer. And as she often did with wealthy and powerful men, she used this relationship to expand her business, this time into the world of fragrance. Chanel had a very clear vision of the fragrance that she wanted to create in her mind. She wanted something that was bold, unique, and unlike anything else on the market. And she insisted on a blend that included musk and jasmine, which at the time were associated with women of the night. However, in true Chanel fashion, she sought to elevate these once taboo scents into the realm of high luxury, ensuring they would be worn by the elite. Beau, understandably, was hesitant, warning Chanel that the jasmine in particular was going to be incredibly expensive. Chanel's response? Then put more of it in. This entire statement encapsulates her ethos: exclusivity, opulence, and an unwavering commitment to create not just a perfume, but a status symbol. The result was Chanel No. 5, the now iconic fragrance that is still one of the most famous to this day in the world. Around the same time, Chanel crossed paths with businessmen Pierre and Paul Wertheimer, who saw great potential in her perfume. Together, they created Parfums Chanel, with the Wertheimers fully financing the production, marketing, and distribution of Chanel No. 5. Under their agreement, the Wertheimers would receive 70% of the profits. The department store owner, Theophile Bader, who had facilitated the deal, would receive 20%, and Chanel herself would just receive 10% in exchange for licensing her name to the brand and stepping away from business operations. At first, she happily agreed to this arrangement, and as Chanel No. 5 became more and more successful, she grew increasingly resentful of the deal and how little profit she was making from her now most lucrative venture. Her frustration festered into a decade-long battle with the Wertheimers over ownership of Parfums Chanel, and she would even go on to say and call Wertheimer the bandit who screwed me. An unsettling remark, considering that Wertheimer was Jewish, but we will get a little bit more into all of that later. To me, it seems far more likely that Chanel simply underestimated the success of her perfume and later regretted her deal, not because she had been deceived, but because she undervalued her own creation. But rather than admit that she had made a mistake, Chanel, as was typical of her, had to reframe the narrative and make herself the victim, claiming that she had been wronged or swindled. Now, to say that Chanel No. 5 was successful was an understatement. She was very clever on how she did the marketing for it, subtly placing it in her boutiques and having key socialites wear it so people might get a smell of it before purchasing, instead of just seeing it in a traditional advertisement. Once again, she had proved herself to be a master of manipulation and branding. And thanks to Chanel No. 5, she now helmed one of the most successful fashion houses of the time. Ironically, it wasn't her clothes that got her there. It was her perfume. And despite only getting 10% of the profits, it still made her an incredibly wealthy woman. In the mid-1920s, Chanel had the opportunity to integrate into British high society through a well-connected friend. Naturally, she seized it, beginning an affair with the immensely wealthy Duke of Westminster. He lavished her with expensive gifts, from fine jewelry to multiple homes in both London and France. The relationship lasted a decade, and while Chanel certainly benefited from it financially, perhaps her most significant connection she gained was through meeting Winston Churchill, a figure that would play a pivotal role in her life after World War II. It was during her time with the Duke that her anti-Semitic views became even more pronounced. She grew increasingly vocal about her prejudices against Jewish people and homosexuals, making shocking remarks to her friends and acquaintances. In fact, her views got so extreme that many in her social circle began to distance themselves, especially as the tensions rose in France with the looming threat of war. Despite their shared worldview, Chanel never seemed to hold the Duke in particularly high regard. When asked why she never married him, she famously quipped, "There have been many Duchesses of Westminster. There is only one Chanel." Once again, she reveals her true nature. Not as the epitome of elegance, but as a self-serving opportunist, using those around her to further her own ambitions while holding little to no respect for anyone but herself. By the 1930s, Chanel's decline was undeniable. She had repeatedly failed to reinvent the designs that brought her success in her youth and was quickly becoming irrelevant in the ever-evolving fashion world. Through her former lover, Grand Duke Dmitry Pavlovich, she was introduced to Hollywood giant Samuel Goldwyn, who made her a lucrative offer. For the sum of $1 million, she would travel to Hollywood twice a year and design costumes for his biggest stars. Seeing this as an opportunity to reclaim some of her former glory, Chanel accepted and set off for America, eager to make her mark in the film industry. However, her experience in Hollywood left her with a deep disdain for the industry. She found the film industry to be distasteful and even described it as infantile, which is rich coming from her. In typical Chanel fashion, she had no problem criticizing everyone else, yet was unable to handle criticism herself. Her designs were understated and didn't really translate well on film, where glamour and opulence were favored. The New Yorker even speculated that Chanel left because they told her her dresses weren't sensational enough. She made a lady look like a lady. Hollywood wants a lady to look like two ladies. Following this failure, she tried to pivot to designing costumes for the opera and ballet. But the response was just as brutal. Critics mercilessly ridiculed her work, with one review even declaring that, "Wrapped in bandages, the actors look like ambulant mummies or victims of some terrible accident." Chanel had gone from being talk of the town to being a woman desperately trying and failing to reclaim her relevance. To make matters worse, Chanel's true nature was beginning to unravel to the public in the wake of the 1936 labor strikes, where 4,000 of her female employees protested for shorter work hours, collective contracts, the abolition of piecework, higher wages, and consistent weekly salaries. Chanel flatly refused all of these demands, seething with anger that these women would dare defy her. In a series of interviews she did, she openly mocked and criticized them, essentially calling them idiots for standing up to their rights. However, public sentiment was overwhelmingly in favor of the new labor protections, and Chanel, ever the opportunist, decided to do what she did best: manipulate the situation to her advantage. In an empty gesture designed to make herself look generous while taking no real action, she offered to sell her business to her workers, knowing full well they couldn't afford it. This was nothing more than a calculated PR move, a way to feign goodwill while ridiculing them further. It's a cliche, but it holds true. Actions speak louder than words. Chanel spent her entire life crafting this myth around herself, one of originality, sophistication, and elegance, only for it all to come crumbling down the moment it's tested against real-life events. After all, who cares if you're fashionable or sophisticated if at your core you're a terrible human being? Chanel cared, though certainly not for fairness, kindness, and integrity. If anything, her legacy is one of self-interest, cruelty, and an uncanny ability to weave lies into history. If there was anything that Chanel hated more than women, Jews, and gays, it was being threatened. And by the mid-1930s, her reign over haute couture was facing a serious challenge by none other than another woman. Elsa Schiaparelli, an up-and-coming designer, was gaining recognition very rapidly, and Chanel's dominance over the fashion world was slipping. The boyish, androgynous look that had defined Chanel's early success was out of fashion, now replaced by softer, more feminine silhouettes. Everything Chanel neither embodied herself nor excelled at designing, while Schiaparelli was everything that Chanel had long pretended to be: youthful, creative, innovative, and effortlessly playful. Her designs were artistic, often inspired by surrealism and critically acclaimed, generating enthusiasm across the fashion world, and it infuriated Chanel. She hated the attention that Gabrielle was receiving, knowing full well she couldn't compete with the young designer's fresh perspective. The world of couture was evolving, while Chanel, rigid in her ways and unable to adapt, was being left behind. A few weeks after war was declared between France and Germany, Chanel decided to abruptly close her shops, claiming that it was no time for fashion. As a result, 4,000 of her female employees lost their jobs, at a time when most of their husbands were going off to war, leaving them to provide for their families alone. Once again, Chanel revealed herself to be cruel and indifferent to the sufferings of others. Her employees pleaded with her to keep the shops open. Even the Labor Bureau intervened, urging her to keep the business open for the sake of these women who needed to work. Chanel, unmoved, refused, for no justifiable reason. Her biographer, Hal Vaughan, suggested this was more than just an act of wartime pragmatism. It was a calculated retaliation against the workers who had dared to strike against her in years prior. By shutting down her couture house, Chanel made a definitive statement, not just about the indifference to the livelihoods of her employees, but about her deeply rooted prejudice. Once again, actions spoke louder than words, exposing her true self and her hatred of women and long-standing anti-Semitic views. Of course, Chanel was going to be just fine. She had already secured her wealth in a Swiss bank account and was still profiting from perfume sales. While thousands were suffering, she was financially secure, proving once more that she looked out for no one but herself. During the German occupation of France, she took up residence at the Hotel Ritz, which had become a hub for high-ranking German officers and elite military personnel. In other words, it was the perfect environment for her. Surrounded by wealthy, powerful men she could manipulate and discard like yesterday's news, and who happened to share her hateful views. So, to no one's surprise, while she was staying at the Ritz, she began an affair with SS intelligence officer and German aristocrat Baron Hans Gunther von Dinklage. Exploiting her connections to the German occupiers, Chanel attempted to take control of Parfums Chanel by capitalizing on the Nazi seizure of Jewish-owned property and businesses. In May 1941, she wrote a letter to the government administrator who oversaw the redistribution of Jewish financial assets, arguing that Parfums Chanel was still legally owned by Jews and had been abandoned by its owners. What Chanel didn't realize, however, was that the Wertheimers had anticipated this move, and before fleeing to America, they had transferred full ownership of Parfums Chanel to Félix Amois, a trusted friend and French industrialist. As a non-Jewish businessman, Amois was able to legally run Parfums Chanel throughout the war, safeguarding it from seizure. And when the war ended, he returned full ownership to the Wertheimers, leaving Chanel enraged and empty-handed. Once again, she had schemed, manipulated, and attempted to take what wasn't hers, only to fail spectacularly. Another bitter loss in her growing list of disappointments in the last decades of her life. Fueled by her growing bitterness, Chanel sought new ways to occupy her time that she deemed to be more productive. These pursuits revolved entirely around the ongoing war and the promotion of fascist ideology. From openly expressing her views at high society dinner parties to financially backing fascist publications to even becoming a spy for Nazi Germany, Chanel became increasingly more unhinged. Her actions during the war would inevitably come back to haunt her. Strong opinions, especially ones as damning as France had it coming, rarely stay behind closed doors. And to be fair, Chanel really never made much effort to try and conceal her true sentiments anyway. Since then, French intelligence documents have revealed evidence about her activities during this time, including her deep-seated anti-Semitism and her open admiration for Hitler. After the war, Chanel was interrogated about her involvement with the Nazi Party and her ties with Germany. However, the case was ultimately dismissed, largely due to a lack of access to key evidence needed to convict her. But perhaps more crucially, Chanel had two very powerful and unexpected protectors: Winston Churchill and Pierre Wertheimer. For Wertheimer, Chanel's Nazi affiliations posed a serious threat, not just to her reputation, but to the Chanel brand itself. As Forbes put it, he feared that a legal battle would illuminate Chanel's wartime activities, wrecking her image and his business. Keeping her past buried was in his best financial interest. As for Churchill, his concern was less about Chanel and more about shielding members of the British royal family. If Chanel was forced to testify, she could potentially expose the pro-Nazi sympathies and activities of high-ranking British officials, aristocrats, and even members of the royal family. According to Chanel's grandniece, Gabrielle, when Chanel returned home, she reportedly said, "Churchill had me freed." During this time, Chanel even managed to persuade the Wertheimers into renegotiating their original 1924 contract over Parfum Chanel. On May 17, 1947, she received wartime profits for the sales of Chanel No. 5, an amount equivalent to about $12 million in today's valuation. Under the new agreement, she would also receive 2% of all Chanel No. 5 sales worldwide, projecting to earn her around $34 million per year in today's valuation, instantly making her one of the richest women in the world at the time. However, the most astonishing part of the renegotiation was a highly unusual condition Chanel herself proposed. Pierre Wertheimer would agree to pay for all of her living expenses, down to the most trivial, for the rest of her life. Of course, this was completely unnecessary, considering she had just become one of the richest women in the world and was more than capable of affording her own lavish lifestyle. But as always, Chanel was never one to spend her own money when she could simply manipulate someone else into footing the bill. How she was able to extract even more wealth and privilege, even though she had more than enough of it already, just speaks volumes on her endless greed and sense of entitlement. How she managed to get them to agree to this deal at all remains a mystery, but knowing Chanel, it probably involved a mix of manipulation and self-serving cunning. If she excelled at anything during her life, it was getting what she wanted, deserved or not, and often in complete defiance of justice. We now know that there was more than enough evidence to put Chanel behind bars, where she rightfully belonged. The classified archival documents uncovered by journalist Hal Vaughan reveal that the French Prefecture de Police had a file on her, describing her as couture and perfumer, pseudonym Westminster, agent reference F7124, signaled as suspect in the file. While many women in France were punished for their horizontal collaboration with German officers, Chanel faced no such consequences. Although she escaped punishment during her lifetime, there is no denying her deep involvement with Nazi Germany. And while she was officially let go, the public sentiment toward her in France after the war was far from welcoming. In 1944, she fled to Switzerland, likely to avoid criminal charges for her collaboration as a Nazi spy, and she remained there for quite a couple of years. In late 2014, French intelligence agencies declassified and released documents confirming Chanel's role as a Nazi agent during World War II. Not only was she a spy, she had direct involvement in a German plan to gain control over Madrid. One of her most significant missions was Operation Model Hat, in which she served as a messenger between Hitler's foreign intelligence and Winston Churchill, to prove that the Third Reich had attempted peace with the Allies. Despite the abundance of evidence, there are still those who worked to protect Chanel's reputation today, mostly stakeholders of Maison de Chanel. Following the publication of Hal Vaughan's book Sleeping with the Enemy in August 2011, which proved Chanel's wartime activities as a Nazi spy, Chanel and her fashion house have been engulfed in controversy. In response, Maison de Chanel released a statement refuting the claims of espionage, although they did admit that their officials had only seen media expert of Vaughan's work. After all, if Coco Chanel's reputation were to fall, so would the company that has clung so tightly to her fabricated legacy. This, I believe, is why many still uphold her lies today. Her brand and company still protect her, even in death, because it's in their financial interest to do so. As Vaughn said, a lot of people in this world don't want the iconic figure of Coco Chanel, one of France's greatest cultural icons, destroyed. This is definitely something that a lot of people would prefer to put aside, to forget, and to just go on selling Chanel scarves and jewelry. At over 70 years old, after having her couture house closed for 15 years, Chanel decided it was time for her to re-enter the fashion world. This was partly due because of the male designers that were dominating the industry at the time, in particular Christian Dior and his new look. Predictably, Chanel had nothing but criticism and mockery for Dior's designs. She was unable to tolerate or accept anything that deviated from her increasingly outdated style. Dior's new look was characterized by full skirts, cinched waist, and soft shoulders. It was ultra-feminine, glamorous, and youthful. It was even credited with revitalizing the French fashion industry in the post-war era. Chanel, of course, dismissed it entirely, accusing Dior of dragging women back to the restrictive ideals of the 19th century and reducing them to mere objects of male admiration. Dior doesn't dress women, he upholsters them, she famously sneered. She even went as far as to say that a woman dressed in a Dior gown looked like an old armchair. The irony, of course, is glaring. This all comes from a woman who spent her entire life undermining and demeaning other women, and also a woman who owes her entire success to sleeping with wealthy men for money, literally being an object for them to flaunt and admire, so long as she got paid, of course. But self-awareness was never really her strong suit. For her comeback, Chanel offered what she always had, her signature look. Instead of innovation, she relied heavily on nostalgia and her original 1920s reviews to generate buzz around the collection. But in reality, her designs were nothing groundbreaking. At best, they were fine. And some of her original reviews from the 20s were less than flattering, with Vogue calling her clothes conservative and Women's Wear Daily bluntly stating, "As everyone knows, Chanel makes little to no attempt to attract interest by novelty." Ouch. This was yet another example of the carefully constructed facade she has spent her life selling to the public. It was also around this time that the discrepancies in her story started to take shape. Since she gave no new interviews for her new collection, journalists had to rely on those old reviews, leading to historical inaccuracies. Styles she had merely popularized were now being credited as her inventions, and if you've made it this far into the video, you'll know that's far from the truth. These exaggerated claims came mostly from American magazines, which, viewing Chanel through a nostalgic, rose-colored lens, were eager to celebrate her long-awaited return. After all, it had been years since she had designed anything, let alone achieved any real success, so her comeback made for an exciting story. By then, most of the designers from Chanel's heyday were long gone, leaving no one to challenge these false claims. And Chanel, she certainly wasn't going to correct anyone. If anything, she leaned into the myth and used it to exaggerate her legacy even more to her advantage. Once again, history was being rewritten by Chanel's lies and masterful manipulation. Chanel's comeback collection was a complete flop in France. Her potential buyers wanted nothing to do with her outdated, uninspired designs, or with her many controversies surrounding World War II. With her reputation in shambles at home, she turned to the American market for the survival of her fashion house. And thanks to the American media's relentless hype, her designs were perceived as fresh and exciting, even though they were nearly identical to the ones she had released decades earlier. Fortunately for her, it aligned much better with the more casual American lifestyle, making the US a much more receptive market. Her final glimpse of success came with the release of the 2.55 bag in 1955 and the two-tone heels in 1957. And as with many of her so-called innovations, she didn't actually invent any of these styles, despite what every fashion magazine claims. Even Karl Lagerfeld himself admitted that these styles existed long before Chanel popularized them. Yet the myth and misinformation that fueled the American market's obsession with Chanel, an illusion that their brand still relies on heavily today, helped propel these designs to success. It's rumored that Chanel favored the two-tone shoe because she was insecure about the size of her feet. The black toe cap is meant to shorten the foot, while the beige body is meant to elongate the leg. These shoes were also meant to be much more casual and for everyday use, just like the 2.55 bag and everything else she created. Even at 70 years old, luxurious poverty was still her go-to. After her success in the American market, Pierre Wertheimer offered to buy Chanel out of Maison de Chanel. Driven by greed and a desire for even more wealth, she happily agreed. The Wertheimers acquired full ownership of the brand, and Chanel continued to design for the house until her death. She passed away in 1971 at the age of 87. And to this day, the Wertheimer family is still the primary owner of Maison de Chanel. More than a designer or innovator, Chanel's true talent was in being an influencer. She knew how to manipulate, how to brand herself, and how to use people, especially wealthy men, to get where she wanted to go. This ability to create a narrative around herself is what built her legacy, not her actual contributions to fashion. While her influence and mark on fashion is undeniable, I think we should all take a step back and think more critically about the so-called icons we celebrate. Chanel's legacy has been protected for decades, not because she was truly admirable, but because it was in the financial interest of the people who profit from her story. Just like she manipulated people for her own gain, her brand has continued to manipulate the public into believing a carefully constructed version of history. Much like Chanel herself, they aren't actually selling handbags and clothes. They're selling dreams and a very powerful idea. The idea of elegance that has a really mystical allure and yet has no concrete definition. For the modern woman who aspires to be elegant, Coco Chanel is usually the first figure she will turn to. I should know. When I was a teenager, I did the same. I thought Chanel was the epitome of elegance. I thought she had invented all of these amazing styles that we still wear today, like sailor tops and the little black dress and shoulder bags. But as I grew older and I read more about the history of fashion, I started to notice the discrepancies. And as curiosity often does, it led me down a rabbit hole. One that over the years has slowly but surely revealed what truly lay behind the myth of Coco Chanel. And as time goes on, I'm excited to see what else we might uncover about her.